seeing, figuring out if we are live and people can see us on YouTube. Takes about a minute. Yes, we are live. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Karwan, the Heritage Exploration Initiative. It is a collective, it is an independent collective of students trying to fight communalization and politicization of history, which is going not just in our nation but across the world now, which is deeply troubling for us and for a lot of other people. So, in this series, we invite historians from all over the world to talk about global histories, to talk about those connections that we forget to make when we were studying and we are studying history today. So, when we forget those connections, we can't work on South Asian history on South Asian history in isolation. We need those connections with the larger world, with other societies and other countries. So today on Caravan special lecture, we have a very special guest. We have Professor Glenn Penny joining us from UCLA. He's a renowned historian whose work reimagines German history through a global polycentric lens, which is very important and I think is the need of the hour now. Challenging conventional narratives and integrating themes of migration, of transcultural belonging, and ethnology. His scholarship spans the globe and centuries, offering powerful insights onto how German identity has been constructed, contested, and transformed across time and space. Professor Penny studies history of belonging, knowledge, and migration, focusing on German speakers and communities worldwide. His work with ethnological museums and deep exploration of German interactions with non-European cultures have earned him numerous accolades, including the Guggenheim Fellowship and fellowships in Berlin and Munich. This talk is also related to his book, his monograph, very important book um called German History Unbound, which presents a bold imagining of modern German history, covering the period from the 1750s to the present and rejecting the traditional state centered approach or the nation state centered approach. He draws on insights from historians like James Sheehan to propose a polycentric vision of German history, one that embraces the experiences of Germans far beyond Central Europe. The book contends that German history must account for global connections, mobilities, and the lives of German communities in diverse locales such as Austria, Chile, and Russia. It also argues that Germanness, quote unquote, has often been hybrid and fluid, shaped by migration, plural identities, and transcultural interactions. By decentralizing the nation state, uh, German History Unbound, the book, challenges dominant historiographical conventions and narratives and insists on the intellectual and political necessity of recognizing Germany's complex yet very interesting past rather than seeking a new master narrative of its own. It advocates for multiple and often, I think, overlapping stories as analytical tools to better understand the human motives and motivations and also the historical realities. In doing so, Professor Penny ex- uh, undermines this exclusionary forms of nationalism and highlights the rich diversity that has always existed within German identities. I think the book also has so much to give to the larger world now, to the larger world order about nationalism, about complex yet very interesting and intermingled kind of histories and connections that we'll get to know in the lecture as well as the conversation after the lecture. So, without further ado, thank you so much, Professor Penny, for accepting this invitation. It is truly an honor hosting you this evening, this morning for you, and I look forward to the lecture, and we'll have a chat after the lecture. So, over to you, sir.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. This is really a great privilege. I'm going to have a PowerPoint, so I'm going to share the screen now. Um, I always screw these things up, so I'll do my best. Oh, it worked out. Um, so if you read the book, then I mean, that was an incredibly generous introduction and a wonderful summary of the book. I really appreciate it. And I think one of the things I try to underscore is that I didn't really set out to write a global history of Germany or Germans. And in part, that's because there were so many really great scholars like Sebastian Conrad and Jürgen Osterhammel who I think had already done that pretty effectively. And since the book came out, David Blackburn has written a sort of global history of Germany. So if anybody watches this is interested in that, those are good places to go for it. Um, what I wanted to do was to explore the very real challenges of narrating German histories without nation states at the center. So I set out to write a polycentric German history that did actually span the globe, but that was kind of its method. It wasn't its purpose. I didn't want to just show Germans were all over the place. I wanted to think about the implications of that. So my goal was to engage the multiplicity of narratives about being German in the early modern and the modern eras and tie those together in ways that would force us to rethink how we conceive of and write what we call German history. And that not only required me to direct our focus beyond national borders and outside of Europe, but also to recognize or the coexistence of multiple overlapping, shifting spatialities in which German histories were taking shape. And those German spaces, I underscored, were as much transcultural as transnational. They're frequently polyphonic. They existed both inside and outside of German-speaking Central Europe, and they were interconnected in all kinds of ways. So as I noted in the book, I never considered myself actually a historian of Germany, of just the state. And that's because most of the work that I've done is to write history through experiences of different kinds of Germans or German speakers. It's not really the same thing, and I much prefer the second. So while I was writing the book, I also realized that my language, in part, in the past had been somewhat misleading because my subjects were seldom only Germans. They were generally people with multiple subject positions, people who I came to think of as German plus other things. And many of their contemporaries also thought of them that way, at least part of the time, and sometimes only implicitly, but oftentimes quite explicitly. And that really shouldn't surprise us, given that German has always been an aggregate category. It was seldom a unitary category. It's been performed over time and space in a great variety of ways. And that continued even after the ubiquitous rise of exclusionary nationalism and passport controls after the First World War. And for that reason, I really stopped thinking of my subjects as static and came to understand them as fluid. I thought of them, I really still think of them as moving targets, changing as they travel across time and space. And as a result, I end up arguing in the book that the term German makes actually a much better adjective than a noun. And I still think that. Now, a number of things happened that brought me to writing the book. And one of them was, and a number of things have happened since I've written it about 3 years ago. And obviously, my arguments have evolved. And in part, that's because of the challenges that I faced during the pandemic. In my case, it just concerning the scholarship, it prevented me from completing a project that I'd been doing on being German in Guatemala because basically I was unable to get back to Guatemala in the middle of the project, and the connections that I'd set up started to fade, and the research was left incomplete. And then in my desperation, I tried to get back to Chile, but something quite similar happened. The delay was a little bit longer, um, and I was having trouble completing that project on German science and everyday life. And something that had begun to evolve, something I started to think of as global Valdivia. Valdivia is a state, a city and a state in southern Chile. And this was a project based on German Chileans' mental maps and the many kinds of networks that German Chileans in that city and the surrounding region um, had, that they worked through with themselves and with their relatives and with their extended family members across much of the Americas and Central Europe. Now, I've been working on that project right now, in fact, and I'll get back to it at the end of the talk because I think the very notion of a globalized German Valdivia extends my earlier arguments that I made in the book. But before I go there, I want to actually start in Central Europe itself with what I think of as central peripheries in German-speaking Central Europe, places, moments that have encouraged me to embrace polycentric narratives, even at the very center of the continent. And once I do that, then we'll return to Latin America. Um, the reason I ended up focusing on Central Europe, but one is I couldn't get back to Latin America, but also I started teaching classes at the Ludwig Uhland Institute in Tübingen, Germany. There's we would call it in English European ethnology. They call it empirische Kulturwissenschaft. It's a field that's kind of like a folks study of German-speaking Central Europe. And I started teaching classes there. And one of the reasons I went there is because I thought, well, if I can't get back to Latin America, if I can't get back to Chile, I can go study the places where a lot of the German settlers came from. And if I better understand the world they came from, then I might be able to better understand how they acted in particular historical situations. And that made sense. At the same time, honestly, I was also really motivated to figure out a problem that had involved in my arguments, which came out actually a bit in the book. I started to realize that, well, one of the things that had always perplexed me is that German capitalists just seemed to be better at being capitalists than the French or the British or the North Americans or many other groups that came to places like Latin America. Everybody knew this. Their counterparts in France and Great Britain and the United States, the various consuls and the ambassadors wrote about this all the time. So it wasn't a revelation. American, British, French officials frequently lamented this in their official reports. And they also wrote about a wide range of popular publications like Harper's in the United States. So this was a well-documented economic and political phenomena, I guess you could say, that historians and others had been writing about. So everyone recognized, for example, that German merchants and coffee capitalists in places like Guatemala were just better than their European and North American counterparts at learning local languages, at integrating into indigenous cultures, at using kinship networks to organize labor and promote sales. And initially I thought, well, this probably has to do with the fact that many of the people in Hamburg, or many of the people in Guatemala who were doing this came from Hamburg and Bremen, former Hansa cities, merchant cities, with long traditions of sending family members abroad to learn languages, which included always local dialects, tying their families into local trading cultures. And I made that argument in several publications before I realized that actually one of the leading coffee capitalist families in Guatemala came from Stuttgart, which is not a Hansa city. It's not a port city. It's down in the southwest of Germany, not too far from Tübingen, in fact. And that surprised me because until I began digging into the work by generations of these European ethnologists, people like Hermann Bautzinger, who taught me that the region I once thought of as being the southern German borderlands to Austria and Switzerland and France, well, and especially what today is part of Baden-Württemberg, it would be the southwest corner, was a microcosm of the kinds of polycentrism and multiplicities of cultures and languages and transcultural spaces that I'd been studying abroad, outside of Europe, which Bautzinger termed border bundles. So there were all kinds of animated, vibrant mobilities, a great variety of these border bundles in the region. And for decades before I even wrote my dissertation in the 1990s, Tübingen's ethnologists had been studying a range of polycentric, polyphonic cultural provinces crisscrossed by all kinds of borders, historical markers, all things that most outsiders, well, people like me, couldn't even see when they were there. Code switching and a patchwork of overlapping regions is ubiquitous, and it's common for centuries among laborers as well as merchants and the educated elites, which meant that for many of the people from these regions, already steeped in a great variety of local languages and dialects, picking up a set of Mayan languages in Guatemala while trading textiles or planting coffee is something that they've basically been trained to do all their lives, but not in institutional frameworks, universities or colonial institutes or things like that. So it was actually the quotidian, the everyday in this German speaking region that explains a lot about the character of Germanophone networks and transcultural communities, and even their economic successes on the other side of the Atlantic, as well as other parts of the world. And as a result, I found myself arguing that a pointed analysis of mobilities, structures, everyday life along both sides of the border between Basel and Switzerland and Central Europe has as much to teach us about a globalized German history than the mountains of texts that historians and others have produced on the eastern border with Poland, where all the conflict and a great deal of violence has taken place. So I could actually riff on that for a very long time. But there are other things that became even clearer as I shifted my focus west from the three or four land region near Bregenz on the Bodensee or Lake Constance to the three land region near Basel on the Rhine. And one of the key issues that emerged um, in the research has helped me to engage in our current concern with colonialism and decolonizing histories and institutions, which has been, well, all the rage really for the last decade in Europe. And a striking facet of this trend, which often gets overlooked further to the north, was the scholarly attention to Swiss relationships with colonialism, which were manifested in everything from the Basel mission's role in the production of chocolate in Ghana to the many ways in which Swiss people, as individuals and groups, more than as members of the nation state or one of the various cantons, those states that make up it, participated in other European states' colonial efforts and successes. Sometimes, in fact, Swiss individuals and groups were actors in settler colonialism. Sometimes their activity was limited to business transactions and direct or indirect investments that tied them to the slave trade and then later to conquest. And the research has followed a general trend actually in German speaking Central Europe because up until the 1990s, a range of historians of business, immigration, migration, they all sought out Germans across places like Latin America, usually beginning with the very first German speaker to arrive in a state, say Argentina, and drawing out the many ways in which that person and the German speakers who followed contributed to the development of an emerging nation state. We have similar stories from all over German-speaking Central Europe, places like Vorarlberg, which I'll return to in a few minutes, where Bregenz is located, and especially histories of migration waves to places like Brazil or to the United States in response to economic hardships. There are, however, more complex histories, and not all of them are contributionist, as Sven Steinberg once termed it, focused on lauding or condemning the contributions of these kinds of German speakers to the histories of other nation states and empires. There's a lot of that. Yet most of these histories and their research efforts were driven by calls for decolonizations, have actually returned to this kind of contributionist narrative and research methodology to demonstrate the many ways in which, well, Swiss people or groups and organizations, or in this case, Austrian, contributed to the excesses and horrors of colonialism, even if they came from a state that actually had no colonial possessions outside of Europe. And like I said, there's very similar work on Habsburg Empire. And ultimately, I think it's fair to say that none of it is particularly methodologically or theoretically innovative. Nevertheless, it's had a great deal of political importance in the last decade in places like Switzerland, where politicians and pundits long claimed that the Swiss, as a unitary category, had no ties to either the slave trade or colonialism because their state never had any colonial possessions. And although that claim continues to circulate in some right wing circles and in the media, it's largely fallen to the wayside in scholarly discussions, much like earlier claims of Swiss innocence during the era of National Socialism. So, one of the most interesting and often overlooked implications of this work is how it recasts our understanding of colonialism in Imperial Germany and in the Weimar Republic, and consequently, even what decolonization might entail, because much of what scholars have demonstrated about Swiss participation in colonial excesses can also be applied to the rest of German speaking Central Europe, which underscores, it's kind of ironic, the relative unimportance of Imperial Germany's official colonies when we're thinking about the ways in which German speakers are involved in the age of imperialism. So the existence of Imperial Germany's colonial possessions, when and how they were acquired and lost, as much as what transpired within them, this is what played, well, a role, the biggest role in scholars' arguments about the character of the German polity, not to mention the regimes that governed Imperial Germany, the Weimar Republic, and later the National Socialists. But today, the broader revelations about colonial legacies make it clear that neither the size of Imperial Germany's colonial empire nor its duration are really as important to our evaluation of Imperial Germany or Germans' participations in European colonialism than what a variety of Germans were doing outside of Imperial Germany's official colonial territories, pretty much all over the world. So some, the coffee capitalists I was just telling you about in Guatemala, they were running plantations with labor tied to the land by debt peonage organized by the Guatemalan national state while generating a huge percentage of Guatemala's GDP, producing profits for German businesses in places like Hamburg. Those profits actually far extended anything from official colonies. Moreover, when we start to think and write about the millions of Germans clearing and settling lands in the Americas during the Age of Empire, they far overshadow our discussions of settler colonialism in the official German colonies. And that, of course, also changes our understanding of the political motor, the dominant motivations behind those actions, so that official colonialism begins to look like only a small part in a wide variety of Germans' participation in the capitalist driven transformations of the globe that take place from the Age of Empire through the interwar period. In fact, that's been well demonstrated by a number of business and economic historians. And if this sort of thing interests you, then this book that's up here by Georg Kreis, his recent, he calls it a research report, is really quite helpful because it not only covers all of the more recent scholarly literature in Switzerland that I was just talking about, kind of weighing it out, organizing it for you. It also situates that new scholarship in current debates in Europe over immigration, as well as broader arguments and questions about race and racism in European societies, into older discussions among Swiss scholars who've been probing Swiss ties into European colonialism actually for generations. But other historians of Europe have obviously been, well, overlooking those conversations. It's really only recently that the studies focused on the impact of their actions among non-Europeans have come to the fore. So there are other ways in which these decolonizing projects are instructive for globalizing German histories, which go far beyond calls for consciousness raising about past generations' actions or debates about compensation, repatriation, and restitution. If you're interested in museums and these debates about things like restitution, I'm sure that many of you have are would be familiar with the Humboldt Forum and the big controversies that blew up around it in 2017. You may know that this led to critical transformation in how we think about engage ethnological collections in German-speaking Europe and actually the rest of Europe, North America, many other places. These are global conversations. They're driven by a great variety of both European and non-European forces, and in my evaluation, they've done a lot of good. Today, for example, many ethnological institutions in the Federal Republic of Germany are engaged in scouring their collections for colonial connections. And much of that research is being directly supported by allocations from the German federal government, from the different federal states, as well as from a variety of scholarly foundations. And the number of researchers devoted to the history of ethnological collections in German-speaking Europe, in fact, is really unprecedented. And the work is important for all kinds of reasons. And again, this is something I could also talk about for a long time as another talk. For now, however, what I want to do is give you a quick example from Basel, right? The border canton of Switzerland that touches France and Germany, and then draw out some of its implications for what I'm working on at the present, how I'm extending some of the ideas in the book. And the first thing to understand is that the Museum of Cultures in Basel, like most of the ethnological museums in German-speaking Europe today, began as what was called a Volkerkunde Museum, modeled on the Berlin Museum of Ethnology at the end of the 19th century. And from the outset, it had a great deal of financial support from the city government, from private patrons. And as a result, it currently contains over 350,000 objects from all over the world. It's an incredibly important collection. It counts as one of Basel's five major city museums, although it's worth actually stressing that Basel contains as many or more museums than it has square kilometers in space, about 40. Uh, it also has patronage networks in the city that are pretty impressive, which I'll return to in just a minute. Um, they're astounding for both their size and their largesse, which is it's part of the reason that this city on French and German and Swiss peripheries is also central to a lot of innovations. Most importantly, from my point, however, is that the canton government in the city of Basel, not the Bund government, the federal government in the capital of Bern, has not only required its museums to research the provenance of its collections, it's also been paying for it. So in the Museum of Cultures, that includes fully funding five people who are digging into all origins of all 350,000 objects in their depot. And that action is being made transparent in a special exhibit called Before All Eyes, which shows visitors the importance of their provenance research in particular collections. They rotate the different collections they're working on through the space, and that research, as they make clear, not only includes identifying objects that were required in more or less problematic ways, it also includes identifying how that work can lead to new forms of collaboration, cooperation with the descendants of the people who produced the objects. So these provenance researchers' decolonizing efforts move beyond Western notions of property and pointedly include interlocutors from regions that produce the objects, subjects, in their collections. So there's a lot of global in these Basel actions. And they not only draw visitors into the museum and help them see the world in new ways, they also help to make Basel a nodal point in new kinds of global networks. And those are ultimately globalizing German histories. So at the same time, the museum has not stopped engaging in and supporting other kinds of research with the collections. So one example, which is especially germane to the kind of work I've been doing, is this dissertation by Tabia Buri, and the accompanying exhibit that was what opened up last summer focused on 12,000 things from European collections within the museum. This is super important for all kinds of reasons. Bury is one of the curators of the European collection in this museum, and her study reminds us that the ethnological museums, which were founded in German-speaking Europe in the 19th century, not only sought out collections from ostensibly primitive peoples outside of Europe, often terms natural peoples, and other cultural peoples recognized as more sophisticated with large civilizations, but also people within Europe. And the famous pathologist, politician, and anthropologist Rudolf Virchow, for example, sent Adrian Jacobson, a collector who provided the Berlin Museum with a stunning assembly of objects from Alaska, British Columbia, and other regions as well. He also sent him to the Tyrol, to Switzerland, deep into valleys. And the museum in Basel did this too, sending its own collectors to alpine valleys as well. In fact, its director of European collections, Edward Hoffmann Kraya, who was a leader of Swiss Volkskunde, was constantly collecting from ostensibly primitive people in Switzerland and the Swiss cantons of Wallis and Graubünden. And to do that, he sent collectors directly to those regions. He worked with local go-betweens to build long-term relationships with other locals, and he collaborated with members of the Swiss Association for Volkskunde, Swiss Alpine clubs, and other groups to increase his holdings. And while he did that, he made sure to acquire plenty of extras, doubles, from locations like the Walliser Lochental, a valley high up in the Alps, because these coveted objects could be traded with other museums across Europe. And as Bury teaches us, it was this kind of trading with the Hamburg Museum of Ethnology, which is now the Mark Museum in Hamburg, that allowed Basel's museum to acquire a lot of collections, significant ones, from peoples in the Arctic. And this is crucial because these transactions remind us that large collecting museums in the north and the people who ran and supported them were just as interesting in collecting from these valleys in deep in Switzerland as they were from places in Africa or Alaska or India for that matter. At the same time, their counterparts in Basel were keen to trade objects from their homeland, or at least another part of their nation state, for objects from non-European places around the world. And so, what this reminds us is that the global project pursued by ethnologists in German speaking Central Europe and multiple nation states included the indigenous peoples of Europe together with those from the rest of the world. It also demonstrates that the kinds of collecting in which they were engaged in abroad, which current continues to fuel current decolonizing debates, were mirrored by actions at home, so to speak. However, those actions also included what are often considered dubious acquisitions, including unfair bargaining, taking advantage of people's poverty, of their personal crises, collecting even extended to human remains, like skulls. This one is from Bavaria. There is, however, another layer to this story, and a kind of twist of sorts that could be part of a tale from Central America or some other non-European place. Because one of the masks on display in this exhibition was acquired by the Swiss naturalist Friedrich Gottlieb Stäbler in Switzerland in 1897, delivered to the Basel Museum in 1905. And as Bury explains, it undercuts the ethnologist consensus at the time that this putatively exceptional valley was especially isolated. The cloth on which the mask was constructed, it turns out, as they figured out during processing and cleaning it, was made of a sack that was stamped with the logo of the Washburn Crosby Company in the United States, a precursor of General Mills, and it most likely arrived in Vallis full of American grain. So this forgotten corner of the world, as Hofwood Kaya, the ethnologist, once called it, was tied into global markets of capital and trade, another way in which we're globalizing alpine valleys. So the most isolated alpine valleys, in other words, were even there was no escaping a globalized German history. And there's much we can draw from these stories about the polycentric character of the sciences and the institutions that were behind this collecting. And for now, what I'm going to do is focus on the relationships between global and local interconnections in some German-speaking Central Europe's peripheral centers. And maybe your perspectives can actually help me better uh, understand this. And I'm quite looking forward to any questions you might send my way. Um, in fact, I spent a great deal of time in the last few years uh, thinking about regions that are not marked out on most of our maps, especially those maps that focus on political boundaries and ignore areas like the Allgäu. This is on the left, the one in yellow, that overlap with the political states in Central Europe, the German-speaking Central Europe, states like Bavaria and Baden-Württemberg. And that border also cuts across Schwaben, which some might argue, as others do, is within the Allgäu and extends down into Vorarlberg and thus into Austria and over into the southwest as well. So just to be clear, the borders of the Allgäu and the borders of Schwaben, these are not political borders, these are cultural boundaries. But that makes them no less important to people's sense of belonging and orientation, just as many of the economic and confessional boundaries continue to animate people's mental maps alongside or layered upon the boundaries of towns and regions and states that you can find when you look on Google Maps. Um, I like to think about this lake, Lake Constance, or the Bodensee, um, as a center on the peripheries of multiple nation states, right? Germany, Austria, Switzerland, and Liechtenstein, uh, because it acts as its own center. It ties the regions all around it together, and it's been doing this since before the nation states were there. It's been doing it before the major kingdoms were there that created it. It's been doing it, in fact, as long as human beings have been wandering around in Central Europe. That I find important. Vorarlberg also, which is the state of Austria in which Bregenz is located, interests me because it's also so far from the Austrian capital of Vienna. It's separated from the rest of the country, in fact, by a gigantic mountain called the Arlberg, which is why the state is called Vorarlberg, in front of the Arlberg. So with this colossal mountain at its back, and with the lake opening up in front of it, Bregenz sits at the conjunction of these three or four nation states. And for a long time, sorry, the light just went off. And for a long time, Vorarlberg was actually an impoverished place. It was one of the locations from which actually poor children in rural areas of Austria and Switzerland streamed north during the summers in search of paid labor. They actually organized these children movements. The term is called the Schwabenkinder, the children who move up in the Schwaben to work for the summers because their families can't afford to feed them. And Bregenz was for a while a center of this migrant labor that was streaming up to the north. And this increased and became more lucrative um, once Swiss industrialists from St. Gallen on the other side of the Swiss border began building their textile industries on the Austrian side of the border to gain access to cheap labor that was mobile, and to take advantage of the fact that the site allowed them to market their products of those labors across the entire Habsburg monarchy without paying customs duties. And it is, in fact, ironic that the region becomes so affluent and that the flows of labor move from going north to coming south, and that the capital starts to concentrate in these areas that were once impoverished. In part, that's because the industrialization made it a center for attracting and producing skilled labor as much as producing the coveted textiles, and that industrial labor started to travel globally with relative ease at the end of the 19th century as mobilities became, well, quicker, faster with rail and steam. Um, the current affluence, however, in Vorarlberg is due also to tourism, and especially to the post-war ski industry, which far outpaced other alpine sports and activities by the 1960s, as the Alps became a center, if not the center, of global tourism. So another way to globalize German histories. That in turn has led to the consumption and the reproduction of the mountains and their peoples by a variety of Europeans and non-Europeans alike. And that's another kind of decolonizing, at least of narratives about Europeans, one that provincializes even this international center of global tourism. And I think it's worth mulling over the implications because there seems to be a good deal of decolonizing going on under the noses of scholars' research by people like these people who are thinking about the Alps when they're not living there and performing, well, a sort of alpineness in other places. So what's been happening around Basel is worth contemplating as well, even if it's not in the Alps. I find it striking, for example, that if we look at a map of Switzerland, we focus on Basel. I drew a big yellow circle around it for you. Uh, we see that it is another city like Bregenz, situated on a boundary water, the Rhine River, that unifies as much more than it divides. And in this case, the Rhine takes a turn up to the north before it makes a big bend up in to divide today France and Germany. And although there's nothing quite as big as the Arlberg nearby, Basel is also backed against the Jura Mountains, which you can see right here, separating Basel in many ways from the major cities of Zurich, which you can see on the map, and down here Bern, which is a heart of it. And in this sense, Basel, like Bregenz, faces or is oriented away from the national center of the nation state Switzerland towards the Great Plain created by the Rhine River between the Vosges Mountains in Alsace in France and the Black Forest in Baden, which is Germany. And it's noteworthy that the Swiss national border was extended around the natural border of the Jura to include the city canton of Basel. It is not surprising because this city, on the periphery of the nation state, was a center of so many things, not the least of which were intellectual traditions like humanism. I mean, there's a reason that Erasmus is buried in the Basel Cathedral. Europe's oldest university and a thriving center for trade made possible early on with one of, well, um, with one of the first, if not really the very first bridges over this part of the Rhine River. And during the modern era, Basel also became an industrial center, kind of like Bregenz, and eventually an international center for chemical and pharmaceutical productions, still is. Moreover, at the end of the 19th century, much like in Vorarlberg, that part of Austria I was just talking about, Swiss industrialists built factories across the border. In this case, not in Austria, but in Germany, not in Bregenz or Vorarlberg, but in what's called the Wiesental near the German town of Lorach, which you can see just under the yellow in my circle. They did this for the same reasons, to take advantage of cheap labor in Imperial Germany and while producing things there, be able to trade duty-free within that state. So, situated at the center of three lands, Basel, like Bregenz, is also part of a region that extends across national borders, but those regions predated and persisted through the creation of the nation states. And while we shouldn't lose sense of their importance in particular historical moments, we also shouldn't overemphasize the national borders because, in some ways, it's hard to know what precisely the three lands are that come together near Basel. This is really important. Is it France, Germany, or Switzerland, as you could see in this slide? Or is it Baden, Basel-Land and Stadt, and Alsace, which are states within those nation states, and which share a good many traditions as well as a common language, Alemannisch, a form of German, which one hears in its many variations throughout Basel, up the Rhine to the north, and down the Rhine across all the way over into Vorarlberg. So the cultural provinces that support these various dialects are, of course, fractured by confessional differences, which were not limited to simple French Catholics and Swiss Protestants, because Baden, like parts of Württemberg, contained mixes of these confessions that were initially marked by the various early modern, they're called Gau, which are basically administrative districts, but were persisted even though those official administrative districts are now gone. Or are they gone? This is the really interesting question because I'm not convinced they are. Because even if they're no longer appearing on our commercial or our political maps, there's no shortage of people who live in these territories, places like Baden, who still know when they are in Oberösterreich or Markgräfler region. These are regions that tourists won't even notice were once there, but people who still live there are cognizant of being a part of. And this is totally fascinating to me. Um, you could learn to actually see the semiotics that mark out these borders if you stayed there long enough. And you'd start to notice them inscribed on churches, on old boundary markers, city gates, on the city halls, even in restaurant menus, where you, if you pay attention, will notice. And in one part, you get fried potatoes with your meal, and in another part, you get kind of a savory pancake. Kratzler, they're called. Uh, but the bigger point is it's not really about the bigger point is that despite the wartime divisions and post-war states that we tend to think about as historians, this transcultural region continues to matter for people's sense of belonging, for their orientations, and even as an increasingly transregional, transnational economic and cultural unit. Much as the regions around the Bodensee continue to be a center, right, Lake Constance, even if it lies on the multiple peripheries of different nation states. And in the central periphery, in other words, we find people in Basel organizing to promote its own kind of regional unity across confessional, cultural, economic, political borders of the nation states, the regions, and the various, well, village and other communities. So these non-governmental efforts began gaining incremental governmental support in the 1960s after Hans Brina returned from serving 3 years in the Armistice Commission in post-war Korea to take over a position as secretary of the Latin American Chamber of Commerce in Switzerland. And realizing that economic and political crises of the war and the interwar period had left many in the region impoverished, and understanding that they were not being particularly well served by the Marshall Plan and other initiatives focused on European nation states, Briner asked publicly if Basel was fated to become a mere provincial city. And that pointed query led to a great deal of public debate and the slow, or one might say, persistent rise of something called the region around Basel, Regio Basiliensis, which promotes cross-border collaboration, collaborative work, and growth, including infrastructure projects, cooperation between universities, businesses across all the states and national borders up and down the Rhine. So it also coordinates joint responses to common problems tied to environment and energy, which have sometimes had a heated history. So in 1974, for example, grassroots regional movements took on state and federal governments, the French, the Germans as well, And many participants underscored their common language, Alemannisch, during the regional and transnational protests against building nuclear energy power plants near the town of Lille, which united generally pretty conservative-minded agriculturalists with pretty radical students and faculty from the nearby university town Freiburg, who tied together fears of nuclear energy with concerns for the future of local viviculture. And those protests ultimately led to occupations, clashes with police, and a kind of local solidarity that positioned itself across the Rhineland border against the government centers in Bonn and Paris and also down in Stuttgart. Less heated but equally important collaborations have led to jointly funded tram lines running across the borders and an airport on the edge of Basel that's recognized as a tri-national space. Basel, then, set on the intersection of multiple peripheries, is a nodal point of transnational, transregional transportation and trade networks. In fact, that's been extended locally as well into the three cities, Basel, Weil am Rhein, and Hunige, which are also building collaborative spaces across the national borders where the three-state region is taking shape as a thing, making border crossings into little more than, well, quotidian afterthoughts, really, um, as people move through this space pretty easily with little indication that they're entering or leaving France or German any more than they would know that they're entering or leaving these older bureaucratic designations of things like Oberösterreich. Since many of the people who live in Greater Basel, they just cross the border regularly. I mean, literally tens of thousands of people across these borders every day to go to work. Now, in this new Europe, what we start to wonder is the ways in which these transnational regions are actually eclipsing the importance of federal states in people's everyday lives. And that's another thing, again, that I would love to talk about and think about, and will continue to think about more in the future. But I think it's an important point for now to the important point for now is how much of that centeredness on putative peripheries has come from local associations of people and places like Basel, which is sometimes but not always also people in the city canton governments, but almost never people in the national government back in Bern, although they might be drawn in after the fact. Important for us then is how this city state, which is also a canton, a half canton, is driven by patronage networks that have long supported the arts and the sciences. And there's a striking amount of independence in this history of the canton and on the northwestern side of the Jura, facing outwards towards other nations, yet surrounded by cultural commonalities that are nevertheless fractured, even in the territory of Basel-Land. And on the other hand, these stories of Bregenz and Basel are important to me because of my larger interest in thinking about spatialities, not just in German-speaking Europe, um, but also outside of German-speaking Europe, in places like Valdivia. In the middle of the 19th century, um, this too becomes a kind of central periphery. In fact, there are a striking number of parallels that kind of blew my mind as I began working on this region again after having spent so much time in Central Europe. So I'm going to wrap this up now uh, by extending my understanding of polycentrism outside of Europe over to the Pacific, where Chile goes up and down from north to south. And I'm going to describe or spend most of my time engaging not with the capital of Santiago or with Valparaiso, which was initially the big port city, but with Valdivia, which is so important because of the German-speaking immigrants who really transformed southern Chile into a highly productive agricultural and industrial region. Um, that doesn't happen by accident because in the middle of the 19th century, it's the Chilean nation state, the ruling members of the Chilean nation state, who began to entice Germans to come to Chile, to come to Santiago, to work as pedagogues, as academics, as scientists, as teachers, to help build Chile's educational and research institutions. And large numbers come over and they do transform this region. At the same time, the state also extends their ongoing efforts to recruit German colonists, agricultural colonists, which began 3 decades earlier in the 1850s to transform southern Chile's agricultural landscape. They also encouraged German businessmen and industrialists and merchants to set up and build cities um, or extend cities like Concepcion, Puerto Montt, and Valdivia. And as a result, a variety of Germans from all over German speaking Europe came central to both colonizing southern Chile for the Chilean nation state and expanding Chile's agricultural, educational, financial, industrial, intellectual, and scientific institutions. So, I mean, there are contributionist histories. There is a lot of contribution to that transformation from these German speakers. And in Valdivia, as elsewhere, these German speakers came together to create a wide variety of associations, like German language schools and other associations that serve social needs that the nation state failed to adequately address. Those included associations dedicated to promoting business and commerce, leisure, sports, education, music, not to mention insurance, and facilities for birth and illness and death. It's these German communities that build the big hospitals in places like Valdivia and organize the firefighters. And they help to build infrastructure, especially communications, roads. Um, Not only did this process help to create thick social networks, but the associations provided a venue for practicing liberal democracy even while living under oligarchies, because the associations had clear, open structures and elections. And the schools, too, were often open and free thinking, or many of them were. Now, these activities were also, it turns out, really great for business, and the Germanophone community of Valdivia played a critical role in the regional and national economies as a result. Most importantly, the city became a center of steamship trade, which fundamentally transformed markets in the region, providing good jobs and relatively high wages for many. So the last decades of the 19th century and the first decades of the 20th century are really a heyday of transformation. There were still class distinctions, of course, but and there were many people working on the fringes, and this included indigenous people, Mapuche, who were from the region but had been displaced by the colonization processes um, and the subsequent land grabs that followed them. And Germans had varied relationships with non-Germans extending up to Temuco to La Frontera, the area that was last controlled by the Mapuche, and where German missionaries were located. These German missionaries were actually Bavarian friars, gained a lot of attention for working with and advocating for the Mapuche during these decades of conflict and transformation. And many of them also worked closely with German linguists and ethnologists in Santiago, people like Rudolfo Lenz, who became critical players in their linguistic studies. Rodrigo Araya Gomez, for example, argues that historians and others have long overlooked the social conflicts and the problems in these communities because of their focus narrating German contributions to the region's dramatic and mostly progressive transitions. And you could actually say that in places like Basel as well. Yet one of the implications of the fact that a small number of German Chilean families drove a great deal of economic development is that they not only dominated the many associations that helped shape Valdivian civil society, but they also played leading roles in the local bureaucracies and government. And that created local networks of power that were decidedly germanophone, sometimes insulated. And we learn a lot about these actions by thinking actually about places like Basel. There's much in this story that's actually quite important when if we're globalizing German history, because we might think about while we do this, the scientific networks that spread across these German Chilean settlements and institutions. And we have. Fantastic scholars like Stephanie Ganger have taught us, for example, that many German immigrants who settle in southern Chile, regardless of their vocations, pursued scientific investigations of the surrounding landscapes. They engaged in geographical measurements, mapping projects. They wrote up ethnographic observations about indigenous populations. Some, like Hermann Krause, the head of the German school in Coral, which is not far from Valdivia, it's on the other side of some water, became a renowned botanist. Moreover, because there was such a variety of these Germans, their networks had many different strands. And Genger once wrote that their personal and academic ties interweaved intellectual currents, open flows of material culture, forged scientific discourses between Santiago and Berlin, Temuco and Kassel, between Coral and Jena. So, local to local, city to city, between Germany and Chile. So there are many ways to discuss the sort of polycentrism of these German networks, right? Not all roads lead to Santiago, not all roads lead to Berlin. But I'd like to end by saying a few words about the German Chileans' mental maps, because we already know a great deal about these kinds of commercial and scientific networks, and we know about Germans' contributions to Chilean state making. It's all well documented. We also know that diverse groups of Germans in Chile, as in other parts of Latin America, remained a conglomerate, a culturally, linguistically fractured and yet linked and pulled together during particular historical moments, like the crises around the First World War. And we know that they tended to be focused much more on local and regional politics than national politics. And again, for a long time, I tended to attribute that characteristic also to the kinds of policies developed by merchants in the Hansa cities, who had long traditions of working in other people's cities, other people's countries, other people's empires, and where any direct engagement with local politics was not only risky, but also pretty bad for their business. There's no question that did shape Germans' actions in places like Guatemala. However, and particularly in the South, that's not actually what was going on. To be honest, I always understood that, but it was only really after I spent so much time studying and thinking about the patrician classes in places like Basel and Bregenz that I realized why that was such a natural thing for these Germans to do once they arrived in Valdivia and began channeling, shaping, and in many ways dominating its growth. Civic self-promotion, including attention to all the things needed at the local level, but neglected by the nation state, was something with which a great number of people from German-speaking Central Europe, despite their varied origins, had experienced and understood. So if we look at the ways in which they directed and managed their networks of associations in places like Valdivia, this becomes crystal clear. However, and this is really my final point, there's another more global element involved in that process of placemaking, which we also can see in some ways around locations like Basel, with its flows of goods and ideas and people. Valdivia, where so many German immigrants took up productive lives, is also a nodal point for the flows of different threads, sorry, not trends, for the flows of similar threads of goods, ideas, and people, which remained vibrant and important on quotidian levels across generations. And I only really understood that after working through personal correspondence that I found in Valdivia around one person, Louisa Rudloff, during the interwar period. Now, initially, this correspondence, the fact that it's extant, enticed me because Louisa Rudolph was a matriarch of one of the region's industrial families, um, which made an incredible amount of wealth producing shoes. They were already well established in Valdivia in the 1880s. And by the time we get to the 1930s, they're moving into their third, fourth, even their fifth generations. Now, much of the correspondence we have from these kinds of families, these German colonialists or settlers, usually it comes from the male heads of households, because they're the ones who ran the businesses and they're the ones whose records get saved. But this correspondence that turned around this woman turned out to be even richer than I'd hoped, because coursing across these decades of economic and political ruptures are consistencies in relationships that were not diminished by distance. Just the opposite, the quotidian connections animating this family's correspondence demonstrates the persistence of shared mental maps among family members in which Europe, Latin America, North America are actually intimately intertwined. These families are not simply spread out on three continents, they're all simultaneously living on them through each other. They're tied into each other's lives by frequent, almost constant correspondence, which was managed and in some ways perpetuated by daughters, grandmothers, mothers, and their children. It's actually amazing to read through because despite our tendency to focus on material things, which I just did a minute ago, a great deal of the Rudloff's correspondence is bolstered by Protestant religion. And as some of the family's young men spent time training and working in Hamburg and other European trading centers, which is what we would expect from the extant historiography. Her daughter Olga spent the years before the Nazi seizure of power in Leipzig, in Germany, with her husband, Friedrich Zietschmann, would become a pastor in the German Evangelical Lutheran Church in Temuco, not far from Valdivia, before being transferred to the Landeskirche Sachsen, right, the head of the church in Leipzig, where he stayed until they returned to Valdivia to his new position in the church just before the outbreak of the Second World War. Now, while he was in Saxony, even before she joined him, Siechmann, Olga, and her mother participated in constant correspondence, often multiple letters every week, and that continued with Louisa Rudolph and her daughter Olga when her daughter departed for Europe, and it continued until she returned. And that correspondence allowed them to simultaneously fill each other's minds with a great number of intimate details about the places and peoples in which they were located on both sides of the Atlantic, and to share with them or to share them with their acquaintances, their families, their other friends in both locations. And the networks then of German Chilean business families were never limited to business, and not all the networks were taking them to the places we expect, like Hamburg and Bremen and other port cities. Rather, as we learn from the Rudloff family's letters, the Germans of Valdivia were incredibly well traveled in Central Europe, just as eager to experience and write about the the sandstone hills and mountains. It's called the Elbsandsteingebirge outside of Leipzig, or the wonders of the Thüringen forests, about the joys of hikes and excursions in the wild European landscapes. They wrote about this as much as profits from the Hamburg stock exchanges. And in fact, the letters from Germany in this correspondence are replete with stories from other Chilean Germans. This is the really interesting thing about it, particularly other Valdivians who are living and traveling in German-speaking Europe at this time. So in 1928, for example, in one of the last letters that Siechmann writes to his wife Olga before she joins him in Leipzig, he begins by detailing a recent visit by Carlos Schneider, notice the first name, and his wife, who exclaims the wonders of wandering in Saxon's hills, where some of the peaks reach 400 meters, which I thought compared to the Andes isn't much, but they were delighted to write about it. He also wrote that Tante Zimmermann moves like a deer through these forests. And Olga's aunt was also delighted, he wrote, to receive her letter from Rio, because Olga was writing to her aunt as she was writing to her husband, as she was writing to her mother, and to many others while she was underway. And while Louisa Rudolph was also writing to them all, and to Der Friedel, as she referred to him, he, in turn, directly after relating stories of Pablo Hoffmann, again, the names matter a lot, and his family in Interlaken, at the foot of the Jungfrau, this famous mountain, he writes to his wife, yes, the big pond is not all that it looks like for the travel-loving Valdivians. How many are coming over now? Indeed, more seem to have come to see the sights and visit friends and relatives while walking along a part of the Elbe or into the Alps than to seek education. Meanwhile, others, such as Dia Friedel, who'd taken up lives in Germany but continued reading the German Chilean newspapers, hosting German Chileans in their homes, corresponding with other members um, who were out and about in interwar Germany um, as visitors, while Friedel, a pastor in one of Leipzig's gigantic religious institutions, was living the life actually as an immigrant, in English with an I rather than an E. Or maybe he's a return immigrant who, well, had actually been born to missionaries in India, believe it or not, then schooled in Saxony, spent decades, however, after that in Chile, before he then returned, so to speak, to Saxony, where he became a host for curious visitors, other German Chileans from Valdivia and its surroundings, taking them into local German landscapes, while Chile, and particularly Valdivia, remained in their thoughts, central in their minds, in their conversations, and recorded in their correspondence. So usually I tend to think of people who migrated from German-speaking Central Europe to Latin America as the immigrants, in this case with an E, in the history of German outmigration, and the new Chilean nationals and the valued immigrants with an I, arrivals in Chilean history. They are the association builders we all know about, who fashion institutions in Latin America, while they continue to have Germany on their minds. Yet Der Friedel is not that, even if he's working on for an international German institution, the Evangelical Lutheran Church, which had a colonial branch in Valdivia, much like it did in Imperial Germany's former colonial territories. Yet this Latin American Friedrich is also recognizably German, even as his relations in Weimar Germany are mostly new rather than old. We quickly learn from his letters, for instance, that he's not only acquired new friends in this new home, but also a godchild. And he hosts common acquaintances, new responsibilities, not the least of which is his niece, Mashita, who comes to Weimar Germany to improve her German, to improve her education, leading Louisa Rudloff, right, the grandmother, to write often and passionately about the child's future and her eventual return home, which concerned her so much that she collected lots and lots of information from organizations created to protect young women traveling alone. That, in fact, is one of the biggest takeaways. Louisa Rudloff writes to her daughter and her son in law many times every week, discussing people's births, their deaths, their illnesses, their delight at getting letters from Leipzig, the family's relations, and she frequently cites scripture to them as she does it. Now, it's not Facebook. The contact is not daily, but it's frequent. And occasionally it's by telegraph. And I think that these shared mental spaces across polycentric German places have a great deal to teach us about the future of globalizing, narrating German histories, as do their family's particular pasts. Okay, I'm going to end there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Penny, for this brilliant lecture and going all the way to Germany and then coming back to Chile and giving us the cross cultural references that the book also talks about. Interestingly, in your book, I'll you know we have about 15 minutes in our hand for the Q&A, so I'll just take that moment to also ask my question that I had while
Sure.
reading the book. You propose using German as an adjective rather than an exclusive noun to capture the diversity and inclusivity of belonging across space and time. How
Mm-hmm.
can historians analytically, if we can say, navigate the historical moments when the noun Germans was deliberately deployed in the exclusive or the nationalistic or even racialized way, particularly by state actors or ideologues, without inadvertently reifying these categories?
Well, I mean, it's a great question. It's one I pondered a long time. And there's, one of my colleagues who teaches in sociology, Rogers Brubaker, spent a lot of time thinking about this. And what he explained to us is that we have to be, as scholars, as people who are analyzing the past, keenly aware of the distinction between descriptive categories, the Germans, and analytical categories. And as you said, people deploy the descriptive ones all the time. And even in their present, they'll try to reify them and harness them in order to give themselves positions of power, actually, in articulating what's best for us, right? A created we. But the danger is to actually see these spokespeople as articulating shared consensus, which they don't. Um, and to realize that the analytical category, then, German is highly problematic, that it's at best an aggregate, that it sometimes functions and deploys in people's understandings, but always is layered upon other understandings of their multiple subject positions. And so the challenge
Yeah.
begins to understand, on the one hand, how these categories, the descriptive categories, play roles in people's lives, but the limitations to those as well.
Hmm. Hmm.
So it just
Uh,
there's actually, there's some really, really great work by people like Jeffrey Lesser, who works on a variety of different kinds of people in Brazil. He started working with German speakers, but then Japanese. Renan Ran, who teaches at Tel Aviv, who does a lot of great work on Jews in Argentina. It will also overwhelmingly remind us that you know, Rogers Brubaker calls it the ethnopolitical entrepreneur, that the spokespeople for various groups just can't be trusted. They're always reifying, even sometimes inadvertently, because the minute you start to speak for the group, you're sort of forcing a consensus upon it.
no, in your rethinking of this kind and of the emphasis that there's this fluid spatial and cultural identities across regions like Basel and Bregenz and Valdivia, how does this approach compel us or make us revise the methodological foundations of German historiography, or any historiography for that matter, particularly in the relation between the concepts of center and the periphery, because those are things that we often talk about when we write history. And also, does this mean for historical, what does this mean for historical narratives that have long privileged Berlin or Vienna or other imperial centers as the primary locus of agency and sort of a cultural production? How do we see that?
Well, I think the first thing is to recognize that not all the agency is in those centers. And I can give you a good example that's in the book, which is to
Hmm.
understand, for example, um, the relationship that Germans had with, for example, trade in Central and South America. The period before the First World War was pretty dominant. Germany, Imperial Germany as such, was the number two trading partner in many of these nation states in Latin America. And the United States was quite upset about this. So too was the British, which seemed to be losing its position, the French, which had already lost its position. And a lot of the evaluations were trying to figure out, well, what's going on here? Is there some sort of prelude to an official colonization? The assumption was this was all being driven by Berlin. That somehow the cultural ministry in Berlin was the one that was supporting the German schools and the associations and the trade and things like that. Um, and then this First World War happens, and the British and the United States take advantage of this war to undermine those Germans' business positions in Latin America with boycotts and blacklists, and then also the treaty that follows the First World War limits the German merchant marine and so many ships and things like that. But interestingly, despite the fact that Weimar Germany, which comes into being as the new nation state, suffers an economic catastrophe and the money becomes
Hmm.
worthless, German business flourishes directly after the First World War. The interconnections are immediately put back into place, and they're put back into place because they were never controlled by the nation state. It's not as if the Weimar Republic was stronger and able to do this. The Weimar Republic was weak and generally disparaged by the Germans who lived abroad, but they were the ones who created the connections. And they made them with people in the Netherlands and other places who then oftentimes loaned them the money to get the ships to go back into business so that these things were up and running and people were doing so well that they were sending money back to their relatives in Weimar Republic who were living impoverished lives as a result of the economic catastrophe that followed the First World War, as well as the catastrophe of the war. Um, so what we see is that if we focus too much on the nation state and give it all the agency, we actually can't explain things like that. And there are many,
Hmm.
many other instances like it where suddenly we just recognize that a lot of the innovation is going on outside of the center, and the center benefits from it, and sometimes only inadvertently is drawn into it. So that's my answer.
No, that's very interesting to see how this connection actually works out, not just in Germany but also I think in Britain. If we look at the larger Britain modern history and the rise of the East India Company. Uh, you also mentioned about the ethnographic museums as knowledge producers, and you emphasize that ethnological museums not only work as a repository of colonial era objects but also as active sites of contestation, not just also knowledge production. So, how might the this provenance research and community collaborations underway uh, in institutions like the Museum of Cultures, uh, Basel, reorient this intellectual mission of ethnographical museums today? And can such museums be reconceived as a decolonial pedagogical space rather than merely sites of this, if we can call it, restitution?
Yeah, I mean that's a fantastic question, and it's one that people are battling with right now. And I think the upshot is that there has been an understanding that these can be places for learning. And in fact, um, when I was talking to the director of the museum in Basel just last summer, she told me that her job just becomes more interesting every as she's there every day, every week, every month, because there's a lot of support now to bring people together to make the museum no longer as a place for passive articulation of perceived ideas or understood knowledge or wisdom, not just a didactic space in which people are instructed, but one in which people, various interlocutors come together to produce knowledge and generate understanding, ask new questions, and also set up future collaborations. And to give you a really great example, there's a nice exhibit that was just set up in the Humboldt Forum, which was a center of tremendous controversy for all sorts of good reasons, and really some pretty ham-handed political moves by the people who are in charge of it. But today there is an outstanding exhibit on Namibia, which was, of course, the site of colonial genocide in former German colony. And this is a tense space to talk about. But now you have this exhibit, which was produced together with people from Namibia, people who understand museums, and people in Germany, and authorities who sat down and said, well, how do we work with these objects? And they created a film about it. And they just went into the archives, they looked at the materials together, they talked about the importance of the materials for science, for the people who had done the collecting, for the people who had produced them, for the people who are living in the country where they were produced now. And then they had a conversation about how this helps us by working with these materials, better understand those cultures, relationships, history, and then they talked more about what more we could learn from each other, with each other. So there's this, you could see through this short film, this moment of productivity on multiple levels that was completely non-existent in these institutions just even 5 or 10 years ago. There have been people who had imagined it. There had been some press. There's been moments in the Berlin Museum, even in the 90s, when a couple of things like this had happened. But those have been kind of, quiet on the down low in the corner with a few curators and some visitors. And now this has become put to the center, and more museums are doing this as well, leading to a new level of conversation that brings different people together and makes these spaces really important because they're not just houses of historical artifacts, which are also historical texts in some ways and many other things, but they also become these places for, as you said, knowledge production and interactions, cultural understanding. A lot can happen there.
Yeah, yeah. Another thought that came to my mind, and I was thinking of your colleague at UCLA, Professor Vinay Lal, when I was thinking of this Central Europe's borderlands and the global South. If we can do a comparative inquiry into it, and you were also mentioning that one must actually think about how we can make parallels. Your work brings out that parallel between cultural mixing in German-speaking borderlands and German speaking colonial settlements in Latin America. And so, how might we extend this comparison to include other global regions? Is something that I think I throw this question to everybody who is listening to us, especially the South Asianists, where multilingualism, mobility, and imperial networks also shaped colonial modernity, so to say. And what are the risks and the rewards of placing Alps and Andes in the same analytical frame as, for say, Deccan and Punjab in India? How do
Mhm.
we do that? How do we approach that? Do you have a methodological approach that you can suggest?
That's a tough question, and it's one I'm still working out. The Alps and Andes connection is super interesting to me because um, it was, to go back to the center periphery question, if I was just working from the point of view of Berlin and I was trying to figure out colonialism and settlement and immigration to southern Chile, I would look at the people's actions and their intentions and their motivations, and I would only be thinking through the lens of basically economies. But when I realized then that you have a lot of the people who are doing the settling are coming from the south, that they have these kinds of particular local uh, efforts at civic self-promotion that they bring with them, or that they come from particular landscapes, which are alpine, and mark onto the Andes, when you start to ask questions about belonging, it's no longer just about economics, right? It's also about a kind of familiarity with landscapes and why there are so many Germans in this particular landscape and why they engage in things there, why they're so important in the science, why they're so important in mountaineering, for example, and why, when you go to the Andes today, you find alpine huts up on the Andes that were created by the Germans, which completely blew my mind that they were there. But of course, they were doing it because that's what one did if you were a German speaker when you climbed mountains. And so it gives me an entirely different analytical lens to understand their actions and their attitudes about being in the area. So I don't think that's going to map directly. I think it would be a mistake to say, okay, now let's follow some German climbers as they go to the Himalaya or something like that, right? And see if they do the same thing. That's not really it. But what I do think we can do is when we go and we see how groups move to another place, regardless of where it is, when they emerge in that place, the motivations are not necessarily driven by even the people who fund them, right? Necessarily like the East Indian Company or some particular merchant group or a nation state, they're going to do other things. So we can't explain, for example, the burst of ethnological collection that happens everywhere the Germans go has
Yeah,
nothing to do with nation states. It has to do with exactly what Stephanie Ganger was writing about in Chile and Peru, the fact that you have people who are settling and starting up businesses, but in their spare time, they map geographies. They don't have to do
yeah,
this. They learn indigenous languages. They don't have to do this. They write up ethnographic texts and they write up dictionaries. Why? Well, in order to understand that, in her case, for example, with the Mapuche in Chile, you understand this because the Germans who were doing this are Bavarian monks. Where did they come from? This particular area in Bavaria. What did people do there? They went up in the mountains and they collected things. Why did they do that? Because that was part of being this part of erudite society. So what are they doing in Chile? They're actually recreating erudite society,
yeah.
right? That's why they're engaging in these kinds of sciences. It has nothing to do with monetary or even political movements at that time. It has something else to do with what one does as someone who's from an erudite society and also a particular kind of religious authority and a monastery and or not a monastery and a mission in southern Chile. So I think that is the beauty is it tells us that there are different ways to think about people's motivations and to explain how they become agents, not just to sort of sketch out the possibilities of their agency.
And to actually think of it, and I think it would be an exciting exercise if some of us, the South Asians, can come together and now form a study group to do this. Um, uh, Not in our countries, but somewhere else, in Germany, maybe, to,
Okay.
considering that both the countries are now fighting a battle, not actively but passively.
Mhm.
But to summarize today's conversation, I think I also was drawn to the last example of the Rudloff family that you cited,
Mhm.
because these kind of examples go beyond the theological, national theologies, and also the colonial binaries that bind them together. It resists both these kind of things.
Yes.
And do you think these examples provide an alternative archives for writing histories of mobility and belonging? And if it does, to what extent do historians uh, trace these histories, and they should actually engage with this?
Well, I do. I mean, I like your phrase beyond the teleologies, and that is the thing, right? Is that the way in which history is constructed to large time. When I went to graduate school, I had to choose: am I going to do French history, German history? I mean, the choice categories were already nation states, um, and that's what one wrote. And so there was already this uh, the cunning teleology of the nation state that made whatever you do fit into its narratives already was pretty stunning. And so I think just understanding that frees you up to do a lot of other things. And these letters are actually fantastic because they make clear, if you're willing to listen, the degree to which what those states are doing is on the periphery of those people's lives, not at the center. And so, which is kind of like the example I gave with how German economies and trade networks are recreated so quickly in Latin America after the First World War. The nation states are on the periphery of these renegotiations. They're not in the center. And so that I think is the secret is giving space in our conceptualization of what drives processes in history to recognize that states matter. Absolutely, they matter. Um, but not always. They're not always the motive. They're not even always aware of what's going around. So, there's this old quip from Scott, "Sing like a state." which helps us understand state actions. But also, one of his bigger arguments was how do you see like the people who are negotiating against them, right? And that is really critical. And I think that these kinds of letters are important to me because in this case, the family is not an active agent trying to resist, right? It's just they're just living, and they're living despite what these states are doing, and that I think is pretty important and gets into a lot of the quotidian that shapes most of our lives even today.
That is very true. Thank you so much, Professor Penny, for this fantastic lecture, for a brilliant book, and a very exciting this panel or this Q&A. I hope that we get to host you again for many more such conversations, especially on these transcultural connections that we were discussing. I hope we have just touched the basics of the book. I think we have to go in depth of the book, and the book is available in India as well for those who are listening to us and might be interested to get a copy. The book is available on Amazon, the online website, and you can get your copies. Those who are watching us and would like to ask any questions, they can always email us those questions at Karwan Heritage, KARWAAN, with your name, and we will forward those emails to Professor Glenn, and he can react or give feedbacks on them via the email. So, with that, thank you so much, Professor Penny, for this honor of uh, of being here, of delivering this lecture. It was truly a big honor for us.
Well, thank you. The honor's mine. It was really great. I appreciate it, and I appreciate you organizing it.
Thank you so much, sir. And for those who are watching us, as I always say before I end the lecture, keep reading, keep thinking, keep questioning. That's how you'll keep yourself sane in these insane times.